Welcome to the Lord of the Dark. Deep within the galactic fringe exist death worlds so horrifically lethal that even the superhuman space marines consider them not worth the cost of conquest. These cannibal planets feature ecosystems where everything, from the soil itself to the atmosphere, actively hunts and consumes any living creature that sets foot on their surface. The Adeptus Astartes have learned through bitter experience that some worlds simply devour armies faster than they can be deployed, making these planets effective no-go zones even for the Imperium's finest warriors.
On Catachan, the plants eat the animals eat each other, and the world itself tries to eat the intruders.
These guys aren't just another band of space pirates. They're a lethal mix of crime syndicate, warrior cult, and noble house, all wrapped in a society that thrives on pain, treachery, and pure, undiluted sadism. No honor, no mercy, no grand ideals, just an endless hunger for power and suffering. But what really makes the Cabal so dangerous? How strong are they, really? If you want to understand just how powerful the Drukhari Cabals are, you need to know where they came from. Because they weren't always the terrifying warlords of Comara. In fact, once upon a time there were no Cabals at all, just remnants of a broken civilization, clawing for survival in the shadows of their own downfall. Now, the Imperium of Man has catalogued millions of worlds across the galaxy, and among those countless entries exist classifications that make even hardened veterans pause before reading further. Death worlds represent a special category of planetary horror, places where the environment itself wages constant war against anything foolish enough to exist there. But within this already terrifying classification lurks something far worse, a subset of planets so aggressively lethal that the Administratum eventually created entirely new designations just to warn people away from them. These are the cannibal worlds, the places where the planet doesn't just kill you, but actively hunts you down and consumes you piece by piece. The first recorded encounters with these nightmare ecosystems date back to the Great Crusade era, when humanity was spreading across the stars under the Emperor's banner with unprecedented speed and ambition. Expeditionary fleets would translate into new systems, conduct preliminary surveys, and either mark worlds for compliance or colonization, depending on what they found. The Imperial Army and the newly formed Space Marine Legions were conquering worlds at such a rapid pace that proper cataloging often fell behind the actual military operations. This created situations where ground forces would make planetfall on worlds that had received only cursory orbital scans, trusting their superior firepower and training to overcome whatever local resistance they encountered. The problem was that standard Imperial classification systems were built around understanding threats from hostile civilizations, xenos species, or harsh environmental conditions like extreme temperatures, toxic atmospheres, or dangerous radiation levels. What nobody had properly accounted for were worlds where the entire biosphere functioned as a single predatory organism, where every component of the ecosystem from the microscopic to the continental had evolved specifically to detect, pursue, and digest organic matter. The early classification protocols simply lacked the framework to identify these planets from orbit, because they didn't display the obvious warning signs that surveyors had been trained to recognize. When the first reports started filtering back to the Administratum about expeditionary forces simply vanishing on certain worlds, the initial assumption was enemy action. Perhaps hidden Xeno civilizations were ambushing Imperial forces, or maybe warp phenomena were involved. Investigation teams were dispatched to determine what had happened to the missing units, and in many cases these investigation teams also vanished without trace. It took decades of accumulated losses and the occasional partial transmission from dying soldiers before the Imperium began to understand that they were dealing with something fundamentally different from conventional threats. The classification system that eventually emerged went through multiple revisions as understanding grew about just how varied and sophisticated these predatory ecosystems could be. Standard death worlds received the designation Mortis Extremis in most imperial records, indicating environments hostile enough to kill unprotected humans within hours or days. But the cannibal planets earned designations like Mortis Vorax or Mundus Consumens, terms that specifically indicated active predation rather than passive environmental hazards. The distinction mattered enormously for mission planning because it meant the difference between bringing environmental protection gear versus bringing weapons capable of fighting the entire planet. What made the classification process so difficult was that these worlds often appeared relatively normal from orbit. Some even displayed what looked like lush, verdant ecosystems that survey crews initially mistook for agricultural potential. The vegetation appeared healthy, the atmospheric readings came back within tolerable parameters, and nothing in the standard threat assessment protocols flagged immediate danger. It was only when boots hit the ground that the true nature of these worlds revealed itself, usually far too late for the landing parties to escape. The survivors who managed to reach extraction points, and there were precious few of them, described experiences so horrific that their testimony was sometimes dismissed as trauma-induced hallucination until the pattern became undeniable. Fan theorists have long speculated about whether the Imperium deliberately suppressed information about these worlds during the early classification efforts, possibly because admitting that entire expeditionary forces had been eaten alive by plants and dirt would have been catastrophically bad for morale. There's something to this theory when you consider how scattered and incomplete the early records are compared to the detailed documentation the Administratum typically maintained. Whether through intentional suppression or simple bureaucratic failure to process information that didn't fit existing categories, the knowledge about cannibal planets remained fragmented and poorly distributed for far longer than it should have. The eventual formalization of Death World classifications created hierarchies of lethality that remain in use to the present day, with the cannibal worlds occupying the highest threat categories alongside demon worlds and certain tyrannid-infested planets. These classifications carry automatic restrictions on deployment, requiring specific authorization levels before any Imperial forces can be committed to operations on such worlds. The fact that Space Marines, the Emperor's own angels of death, are included in these restrictions tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the Imperium takes these threats. The biological mechanisms that make cannibal planets actively predatory represent some of the most nightmarish evolutionary developments ever catalogued by Imperial science. These aren't just dangerous ecosystems where predators happen to thrive. These are entire planetary biospheres that function as singular hunting organisms, with every living thing coordinated toward one purpose: the consumption of anything foolish enough to land on their surface. What makes these worlds so uniquely terrifying is the interconnected nature of their predatory systems. On a normal death world, you might face dangerous creatures, toxic plants, or hostile terrain. But cannibal planets operate on an entirely different principle. The flora, fauna, atmosphere, and even the geological features work together in a kind of planetary symbiosis that turns the entire world into one massive digestive tract. Magos biologists, who have studied recovered data from failed expeditions, describe it as encountering a single macroorganism that simply happens to be planet-sized. The plant life on these worlds doesn't just passively sit there waiting for prey. Vegetation on cannibal planets actively participates in the hunt. Root systems extend for kilometers underground, connected through chemical and possibly even bioelectrical networks that allow them to communicate the presence of prey across vast distances. When something lands on the surface, the entire botanical network becomes aware within minutes. Trees don't just provide cover for predators, they actively corral prey toward killing zones, shifting their branches to block escape routes, releasing pheromones that attract swarms of carnivorous insects, and even producing subsonic vibrations that disorient victims and make navigation impossible. Some of the recovered picked captures show forests that literally rearrange themselves around fleeing survivors. Paths that existed moments before simply close up as vegetation moves with disturbing speed. What appeared to be clearings turn out to be digestive pits lined with enzyme-secreting mosses. The boundary between plant and animal becomes meaningless on these worlds, with organisms that defy easy classification lurking everywhere. There are things that look like ferns but move like serpents, flowers that spray paralytic toxins with pinpoint accuracy, and grass that wraps around ankles and drags victims underground before they can even scream. The animal life has evolved alongside these botanical horrors in perfect synchronization. Predators on cannibal planets don't compete with each other the way they would on normal worlds. Instead, they've developed cooperative hunting strategies that suggest either remarkable evolutionary pressure or something far more sinister guiding their development. Pack hunters will drive prey toward ambush predators, which then wound victims and leave them for swarms of smaller creatures to finish off. Nothing is wasted. Nothing escapes. The entire food web is oriented around the efficient processing of any biomass that enters the ecosystem. What truly disturbs the Magos biologists is the speed at which these ecosystems adapt. Normal evolutionary processes take millions of years, but cannibal planets have been observed to develop specific countermeasures against imperial technology within decades of first contact. Creatures that were vulnerable to lass fire in early expeditions somehow developed heat-resistant carapaces by the time follow-up forces arrived. Plants that could be burned with promethium became flame-retardant. It's as if the entire planet learns from each encounter and prepares itself for the next one. There's a theory among certain radical biologies that these worlds possess a form of distributed intelligence. Not sentience in any way we would recognize, but a kind of planetary-scale instinct that coordinates all life toward common goals. Some have compared it to an immune system, with the planet treating any landing force as an infection to be eliminated and consumed. Others suggest something darker, that these biospheres were deliberately engineered by some ancient intelligence to serve as the ultimate defensive weapons, consuming any who would try to colonize them. The reproductive strategies of cannibal planet organisms add another layer of horror. Many species have evolved to use the bodies of consumed prey as incubation sites for their offspring. A single space marine's corpse can spawn thousands of new predators, each one carrying genetic information harvested from the consumed victim. This means that every expedition that fails doesn't just die. It actively strengthens the planet's ability to kill the next expedition. Some recovered gene samples show organisms that have incorporated Astartes DNA into their own biology, producing predators with enhanced strength, durability, and aggression specifically optimized for hunting superhuman prey. The Adeptus Astartes have conquered worlds that would make any mortal army weep with despair. They've fought through demon-infested hellscapes, cleared hive cities swarming with genestealers, and pacified civilizations armed with technology that could crack continents. So, when the first expeditions were launched to these cannibal planets, nobody expected anything other than another hard-won victory. The Space Marines went in with the confidence of warriors who had never truly been humbled by nature itself. What they found instead was something that would fundamentally reshape how the Imperium viewed certain categories of death worlds. The earliest recorded catastrophic loss occurred during the Great Crusade itself, when a company from a legion whose name has been deliberately expunged from records made planetfall on a world designated only as Theta Carnifex 7. The initial auger scans showed no signs of civilization, no technological signatures, nothing that suggested organized resistance. Just dense vegetation and atmospheric readings that were within tolerable parameters for unaugmented humans. The Legion commanders considered it a routine compliance action, possibly requiring nothing more than planting an Imperial flag and moving on. They couldn't have been more catastrophically wrong. The first drop pods landed without incident. Tactical squads deployed in standard formation, establishing a perimeter and beginning their survey of the landing zone. For approximately 3 hours, nothing happened. The legionaries reported thick jungle conditions, unusual silence from local fauna, and soil that seemed unusually soft underfoot. Then the screaming started on the Vox channels, and it didn't stop until every single warrior was dead. What the after-action reports pieced together from the fragmented transmissions painted a picture of absolute chaos. The ground itself had begun consuming the Space Marines from the feet up. Warriors in full power armor found themselves sinking into what had appeared to be solid earth, their enhanced strength utterly useless against a substance that behaved like quicksand but dissolved ceramite on contact. Those who tried to help their brothers found their own footing giving way. The jungle canopy descended on the survivors, vines and branches moving with predatory speed to entangle and immobilize any legionary who hadn't already been claimed by the soil. The commanding captain managed to transmit a final message before his Vox went silent. He reported that his legs had been completely dissolved up to the thigh despite his armor's integrity seals, and that he could see his brothers being pulled apart by plants that moved faster than any unaugmented human could run. His last words were a warning to any Imperial forces that might follow: do not land, do not attempt rescue, burn this world from orbit if possible. Then nothing but static. The Legion dispatched a second force, larger this time, with heavy armor support and instructions to maintain constant movement and establish no fixed positions. They lasted 6 hours. The tanks began sinking into the ground the moment they stopped moving, their massive weight actually accelerating their consumption by the planetary digestive system. The infantry who attempted to fight on foot found themselves attacked from every direction simultaneously. Trees launched crystalline spines that penetrated power armor at the joints. The air itself became thick with spores that clogged respirator intakes and began dissolving exposed flesh on any Marine whose helmet seals had been compromised. What made these early losses so psychologically devastating was how utterly helpless the Space Marines proved to be. These were warriors who had faced Xenos horrors and emerged victorious. They had charged into the guns of technologically superior civilizations and broken them through sheer determination and superhuman capability. But you cannot charge at the ground beneath your feet. You cannot break the morale of an atmosphere that wants to digest you. The standard Space Marine tactical doctrines assumed an enemy that could be identified, engaged, and destroyed. Cannibal planets offered no such target, just an omnipresent hunger that attacked from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The losses mounted across multiple legions during the Great Crusade era. Each time, the pattern repeated itself with horrifying consistency. Initial landing would proceed normally, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Then the planet would begin feeding, and every warrior on the surface would die regardless of their skill, equipment, or tactical genius. Some expeditions attempted to establish void-shielded bases, hoping that cutting themselves off from the planetary ecosystem would provide protection. The planets simply waited, sometimes for weeks, until the shields failed or supplies ran low, then consumed everyone the moment they stepped outside their protective bubbles. The fan community has long debated whether these early expeditions represented a failure of Imperial intelligence gathering or something more sinister. Some theorists suggest that the Mechanicum deliberately withheld data about these worlds, wanting to study their impossible biology without interference from military operations. Others propose that certain factions within the early Imperium use these planets as convenient disposal sites for troublesome commanders or politically inconvenient forces. The truth is probably simpler and more tragic. The Imperium had never encountered anything like these worlds before, and arrogance led to catastrophe. The moment a drop pod's hatch blows open on a cannibal planet, the killing begins before a single boot touches the ground. The atmosphere itself is the first predator, and it's arguably the most insidious because you can't fight air. You can't shoot it, you can't outmaneuver it, and on these worlds you absolutely cannot survive prolonged exposure to it without the most advanced environmental sealing technology the Imperium possesses. Even then, the atmosphere finds ways to get inside. It seeps through microscopic gaps in armor joints. It exploits the tiniest imperfections in rebreather seals. It waits for that one moment when a battle brother takes damage and his armor integrity drops by even a fraction of a percent. The chemical composition of these atmospheres reads like a toxicologist's fever dream. Imperial analysts have cataloged gaseous mixtures that include everything from highly concentrated enzymatic compounds to airborne bacterial cultures that begin breaking down organic tissue on contact. Some cannibal planets feature atmospheres so caustic that unprotected flesh begins dissolving within seconds of exposure. The Departamento Munitorum has classified recordings of Imperial Guard units caught in atmospheric breaches where soldiers literally melted inside their compromised hazmat suits, their screams cutting out as the corrosive air ate through their vocal cords before finishing the rest of them. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. These atmospheres aren't just passively toxic. On true cannibal planets, the atmospheric threats display what can only be described as predatory behavior. The gaseous compounds concentrate around detected life forms. They flow toward warmth and movement. Some Imperial theorists believe the atmospheres contain microscopic organisms or chemical compounds that are attracted to the biological signatures of living creatures, creating clouds of dissolution that actively hunt their prey across the planetary surface. Imagine running from a fog bank that follows you, that speeds up when you speed up, that somehow always knows exactly where you're trying to escape to. The Space Marines who survived early expeditions reported atmospheric phenomena that defied conventional meteorology. Toxic fog banks that moved against prevailing winds to engulf advancing squads. Chemical rainstorms that seemed to target concentrations of troops with unnatural precision. One particularly disturbing account from a Salamanders veteran described watching a battle brother get separated from his squad by approximately 50 meters, only to witness the atmospheric haze visibly thicken around the isolated Marine while remaining relatively clear around the main group. The planet was hunting the weakest target, isolating it for easier consumption. Temperature plays a crucial role in how these atmospheric threats operate. Many cannibal planets maintain surface temperatures specifically calibrated to maximize the effectiveness of their airborne predatory compounds. Some run hot enough that the caustic elements remain in their most active gaseous state at all times. Others cycle through temperature variations that cause the atmosphere to shift between relatively safe and actively lethal phases, creating windows of false security that lure prey into the open before the killing chemistry returns. Marines have reported watching their atmospheric sensors fluctuate wildly as the very air around them seemed to breathe, inhaling during safe periods and exhaling death during active hunting phases. The moisture content of these atmospheres adds another layer of lethality. Water vapor on cannibal planets often carries dissolved compounds that accelerate the breakdown of protective equipment. Power armor designed to withstand the vacuum of space, the pressure of deep ocean trenches, and the heat of volcanic environments finds itself slowly compromised by humidity that eats away at seals and gaskets over time. Extended operations become impossible not because the Marines themselves fail, but because their equipment gradually loses integrity as the atmosphere works its way inside. Some veterans describe the sensation of feeling their armor growing looser around them as the internal padding and synthetic muscle layers begin dissolving from atmospheric infiltration. Perhaps most disturbingly, several cannibal planets feature atmospheres that specifically target the biological components of space marine physiology. The Adeptus Astartes are post-human warriors whose bodies contain 19 specialized organs not found in baseline humans. Some atmospheric compounds on these death worlds appear engineered to attack these specific organs. Marines have reported feeling their secondary heart struggling, their multi-lung filtering capacity overwhelmed, their succinate membrane activating involuntarily as their bodies desperately try to enter suspended animation to escape the atmospheric assault. Whatever created these worlds understood space marine biology at a level that suggests deliberate design rather than random evolution. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy you cannot see or strike compounds the physical dangers. Space Marines are trained to face any foe with courage and righteous fury. But how do you maintain combat effectiveness when every breath might be your last? When the simple act of existing in an environment slowly kills you regardless of your skill or valor? The atmosphere becomes an omnipresent source of dread that saps morale and focus even among the superhuman Adeptus Astartes. Veterans of Cannibal Planet expeditions describe a constant low-level anxiety that never fully dissipates. The knowledge that death surrounds them in every molecule of air they're forced to process through their armor's filtration systems. If the atmosphere on these cannibal planets is the first line of attack, the ground beneath your feet is where the real horror begins. Imperial forces have faced hostile terrain on countless worlds, quicksand deserts, volcanic plains, ice sheets that crack without warning. But nothing in the Imperium's vast catalog of dangerous environments compares to soil that actively digests you while you're still standing on it. This isn't metaphorical. This isn't some dramatic exaggeration for dramatic effect. The ground on these worlds functions as a planetary-scale digestive system, and every step a space marine takes is a step into the mouth of something incomprehensibly hungry. The first detailed analysis of this phenomenon came from the few servo skulls and automated probes that managed to transmit data before being consumed themselves. What they revealed was genuinely unprecedented in Imperial xenobiology. The soil on these cannibal planets isn't composed of inert minerals and decomposed organic matter like on most worlds. Instead, it's a living substrate, a vast network of microscopic organisms so densely packed that what looks like dirt is actually a continuous biomass stretching potentially kilometers deep. These organisms exist in a state of constant metabolic activity, secreting enzymes and acids capable of breaking down virtually any organic compound they encounter. When something lands on the surface, the soil doesn't just sit there passively. It begins dissolving whatever touches it immediately, drawing nutrients downward through capillary action into the deeper layers where larger colonial organisms process the broken-down material. Space Marines discovered this the hardest way imaginable. Power armor provides extraordinary protection against conventional threats, but the seals and joints were never designed to resist sustained enzymatic assault from below. Brothers who stood still for too long during firefights found their boot seals compromised within minutes. The acids worked their way through microscopic imperfections in the ceramite, found the flexible joints at ankles and knees, and began eating through the body glove beneath. Reports describe warriors suddenly collapsing as the ground literally consumed their legs from beneath them, the soil rising up around their armor like a hungry tide responding to the presence of fresh meat. What makes this even more terrifying is the apparent intelligence behind the process. Servitor analysis of soil samples, conducted under the most stringent quarantine protocols after multiple catastrophic containment breaches, revealed that the organisms respond to pressure and heat signatures. They know when something living is standing above them. The enzymatic secretions intensify dramatically beneath a footprint compared to surrounding areas, suggesting the soil can somehow sense where prey is located and concentrate its digestive efforts accordingly. Some tech priests theorize the entire planetary substrate functions as a distributed neural network, processing information about surface activity and coordinating responses across vast distances. The ground itself might be thinking about how best to consume you. The consumption process is horrifically efficient. Once the soil breaches armor integrity, it doesn't just dissolve flesh, it actively pulls material downward. Victims describe a sucking sensation, as if the ground is drinking them. This isn't passive dissolution, it's active feeding. The biomass extends tendrils into any opening it creates, accelerating the breakdown process and drawing nutrients deeper into the planetary digestion system. A fully armored space marine standing motionless on contaminated soil can be reduced to scattered ceramite plates, floating on a churning organic sea within an hour. The armor survives longest because it's inorganic, but eventually even that gets pulled under as the soil shifts and flows around it. Movement offers temporary protection, which is why the early expeditions didn't immediately realize the danger. Walking disrupts the soil's ability to concentrate its enzymatic assault on any single point. But constant movement is exhausting even for transhuman warriors, and eventually fatigue forces a pause. Combat makes the situation exponentially worse. A space marine bracing to fire a heavy weapon, taking cover behind a rock formation, or simply stumbling from enemy fire creates exactly the kind of sustained contact the soil needs to begin its work. The tactical implications are catastrophic. Every engagement becomes a race against digestion, with warriors forced to keep moving even while under fire from native predators specifically evolved to slow them down. Fan theories about the soil's origins range from the disturbing to the genuinely cosmic in scope. Some argue these worlds were deliberately seeded with engineered organisms designed to create impenetrable planetary defenses, possibly by the Old Ones during their war against the Necrons. Others suggest the soil represents a form of life so ancient it predates current galactic biology entirely, something that evolved when the galaxy was young and hungry, before the rise of species that could fight back. The most chilling theory proposes that the soil isn't native to these planets at all, but rather a single organism that has spread across multiple worlds, connecting them through unknown means into a distributed feeding network spanning the galactic fringe. If true, the cannibal planets aren't separate threats, but appendages of something far larger and far more deliberately predatory than anyone wants to contemplate. The atmospheric horrors and digestive terrain would be enough to classify these worlds as some of the most dangerous environments in the galaxy. But cannibal planets have one more nightmare waiting for any expedition that somehow survives the initial landing. The native fauna on these worlds represents evolutionary development so extreme, so perfectly calibrated for destruction, that many imperial scholars have questioned whether natural selection alone could produce such efficient killing machines. These creatures haven't just adapted to hunt prey. They've evolved specifically to overcome the most dangerous opponents in the galaxy, the superhuman warriors of the Adeptus Astartes themselves. The first thing that strikes any observer about cannibal planet fauna is the sheer scale of the predators. These aren't creatures that evolved to hunt small game or even large herbivores. The apex predators on these worlds regularly exceed the size of Imperial battle tanks, with some specimens documented at lengths rivaling small starships. But size alone doesn't make them space marine killers. What makes them truly terrifying is the combination of mass with speed that defies all conventional biological understanding. Creatures weighing dozens of tons have been observed moving faster than a charging assault marine, their musculature so overdeveloped and their nervous systems so hyper-efficient that they can close distances that should provide adequate reaction time before an Astartes can even raise his weapon. The kill speed of these organisms means that traditional combat doctrines, establishing firing lines, coordinated volleys, tactical withdrawal, become meaningless when your enemy crosses 100 meters in the time it takes to acquire a target. The sensory capabilities of cannibal planet fauna have evolved to detect prey through methods that render standard Astartes stealth protocols completely useless. These creatures don't just hunt by sight or sound or smell, though they excel at all three. Many species have developed sensitivity to the electromagnetic signatures produced by power armor systems, meaning a space marine in full battle plate might as well be carrying a screaming beacon, announcing his position to every predator within kilometers. Some fauna can detect the specific bioelectric patterns of transhuman nervous systems, distinguishing space marine prey from baseline humans with disturbing accuracy. Others have evolved sensitivity to the subtle vibrations produced by enhanced musculature, able to track an Astartes through dense vegetation by the unique frequency of his footfalls alone. There are documented cases of predators ignoring wounded human auxiliaries entirely to pursue space marine targets, suggesting these creatures have learned, through evolution or something more disturbing, that the superhuman warriors represent the most valuable prey. The offensive capabilities of these organisms read like a catalog of weapons specifically designed to defeat Astartes' armor and physiology. Natural weaponry on cannibal planets doesn't consist of mere claws and teeth, though those are present in abundance and sized appropriately for tearing through ceramite. Many species have developed biological projectile systems that fire bone spines or crystallized toxins at velocities approaching bolter rounds, allowing them to engage space marines at range before closing for the kill. Others have evolved acidic secretions so potent they can eat through power armor seals in seconds, exposing the enhanced flesh beneath to further attack. Some of the most dangerous fauna possess electromagnetic disruption organs that can scramble power armor systems on contact, leaving space marines trapped in suddenly immobile shells while predators tear them apart at leisure. The toxins and venoms produced by cannibal planet fauna deserve special attention because they represent some of the only biological agents capable of actually threatening Astartes' physiology. Space marines possess multiple redundant organs specifically designed to neutralize poisons: the oolitic kidney, the preomnor, enhanced liver function, making them functionally immune to toxins that would kill baseline humans thousands of times over. The creatures on cannibal planets have evolved venoms that bypass these protections entirely. Some produce neurotoxins so complex that even the oolitic kidney cannot filter them quickly enough to prevent nervous system damage. Others secrete compounds that specifically target the additional organs unique to space marine physiology, attacking the Becher's gland, the Susan membrane, the catalepsian node, as if these creatures somehow understand the biology they're fighting against. Apothecaries who've examined the few recovered casualties have reported venom compositions so precisely calibrated to Astartes' biochemistry that natural evolution seems an insufficient explanation. The hunting behaviors exhibited by cannibal planet fauna demonstrate tactical sophistication that challenges assumptions about animal intelligence. These creatures don't simply attack in frenzied swarms, though mass assaults certainly occur. Many species employ coordinated pack tactics that would impress veteran military commanders, with individuals taking specific roles: flankers driving prey toward ambush positions, distractors drawing fire while heavy strikers approach from blind spots, specialized killers targeting wounded or isolated targets with ruthless efficiency. Some predators have been observed deliberately triggering the digestive soil systems to trap space marine squads, then waiting at the edges of dissolution zones for prey to be forced into their killing grounds. Others work in apparent cooperation with the atmospheric organisms, driving targets into areas of concentrated spore density or acidic fog banks before moving in for the kill. Perhaps most disturbing is the apparent learning capability these creatures demonstrate. Fauna on cannibal planets don't just hunt with instinct, they adapt to space marine tactics with frightening speed. Predators that survive initial encounters with Astartes forces have been observed changing their approach patterns, avoiding the firing arcs of heavy weapons, timing their attacks to coincide with reload cycles, even targeting specific weak points in power armor that they could only have learned through previous combat experience. Some Imperial theorists believe these creatures possess a form of genetic memory, passing tactical information to offspring through biological mechanisms that remain poorly understood. The Imperial records contain accounts of losses so complete, so utterly catastrophic, that they've been classified at the highest levels of the Administratum. These aren't stories of heroic last stands or fighting retreats where a handful of survivors carried tales of valor back to their chapter. These are accounts of total annihilation, where entire companies of space marines, 100 of the Imperium's finest warriors, each worth 1,000 mortal soldiers, simply vanished into planetary maws that left nothing behind but silence and empty vox channels. The Crimson Fists learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible during what they now refer to only as the devouring of Carthax Prime. A full company, the Fourth, was deployed to what initial survey teams had classified as a hostile but conquerable death world. The chapter had dealt with death worlds before. Their veterans had survived campaigns on planets that would kill ordinary humans within minutes. Carthax Prime was supposed to be another entry in their long list of victories over hostile environments. Instead, it became a wound in their chapter history that has never fully healed. The Fourth Company made planetfall in standard formation, establishing a defensive perimeter around their landing zone, while scouts pushed outward to assess the terrain. For the first 6 hours, everything proceeded according to protocol. The atmosphere was corrosive but manageable with proper sealing. The local flora showed signs of aggressive behavior, but nothing their flamers couldn't handle. Captain Aldrich Vorn reported to Chapter Command that the operation was proceeding smoothly and estimated full planetary pacification within standard campaign parameters. Then the Vox went dead. Not gradually, not with scattered reports of contact or calls for reinforcement. One moment, 100 Space Marines were coordinating their advance across the planetary surface. The next moment, absolute silence. Chapter Command waited for the interference to clear, assuming some form of electromagnetic disruption was responsible. When no communication resumed after 12 hours, a second force was assembled for investigation. What the relief force found defied explanation. The landing zone was exactly where it should have been, the drop pods still standing in their impact craters. But there were no bodies, no equipment, no signs of combat. The Fourth Company had simply ceased to exist. Even more disturbing, the ground around the landing site had changed. What had been rocky terrain during the initial landing was now covered in a thick, organic layer that pulsed faintly when examined with Auspex equipment. The relief force's apothecary took samples before the captain wisely ordered immediate withdrawal. Analysis of those samples revealed genetic material from Crimson Fist's gene seed. The planet hadn't just killed the Fourth Company. It had absorbed them completely, incorporating their very genetic legacy into its biomass. The Crimson Fists declared Carthax Prime perdita extremis, and have never spoken publicly of the devouring since. The Iron Hands suffered a similar fate on a world they designated Forge Grave 7, though their loss carried additional horror due to the chapter's extensive cybernetic augmentation. The Iron Hands believed their mechanical enhancements would provide advantages against biological threats. Their flesh might be vulnerable, but surely plasteel and ceramite would resist digestion. They were catastrophically wrong. The expedition included 63 battle brothers, heavily augmented even by Iron Hands standards. Some had replaced more than 80% of their original bodies with mechanical components. When the planet's ecosystem began its assault, these augmentations actually accelerated their deaths rather than preventing them. The digestive microorganisms in the soil had evolved to break down mineral compounds as efficiently as organic matter. The Iron Hands watched in horror as their mechanical limbs corroded and dissolved, the planet consuming their metal bodies with the same hunger it showed for flesh. The last transmission from Forge Grave 7 was from Tech Marine Vastok, whose Vox unit survived longest due to its position high on his armored collar. His final words, recorded and preserved in Iron Hands archives, describe watching his brothers being pulled into the ground as their legs dissolved beneath them. He spoke of reaching toward the sky as the soil climbed his body, of feeling the planet's hunger as something almost conscious, almost satisfied, then static and nothing more. The Salamanders attempted a rescue operation decades later, having developed what they believed were countermeasures based on recovered data from previous expeditions. Their pyroclast units were equipped with continuous burn flamers designed to keep the ground itself at bay while the force advanced. For a time, the strategy seemed to work. Fire did slow the soil's advance, creating temporary safe zones where Marines could stand without being immediately consumed. But the planet adapted. Within hours of the Salamander's landing, the local ecosystem began producing fire-resistant variants of its digestive organisms. The ground stopped retreating from flame and started advancing through it. Worse, the fire itself seemed to trigger an accelerated response from the fauna, as if the planet recognized a genuine threat and prioritized its elimination. The Salamanders fought for 3 days, their flamers burning continuously, their ammunition supplies dwindling with each passing hour. When their fuel ran dry, the planet closed in. 17 Salamanders managed to reach extraction, the only survivors from a force of over 80. Their accounts painted a picture of hell itself, rising to consume their brothers, of the ground opening like mouths beneath Marines who had survived centuries of warfare, of creatures emerging from the soil that seemed specifically designed to counter Salamander tactics. The chapter has never attempted another landing on that world, and the survivors carry psychological scars that even their legendary resilience cannot fully heal. The decision to abandon conquest attempts on cannibal planets didn't come easily, and anyone who understands the institutional culture of the Adeptus Astartes knows why. Space Marines don't retreat. They don't surrender. They don't admit that any world in the galaxy lies beyond their ability to conquer. For 10,000 years, the chapters have maintained a culture of absolute supremacy, an unshakable belief that no enemy, no environment, no challenge exists that cannot be overcome through superior faith, superior training, and superior firepower. Suggesting that certain planets should simply be left alone wasn't just a tactical recommendation. It was borderline heresy against everything the Space Marines believed about themselves. The strategic reassessment began not with any single chapter admitting defeat, but with the Administratum's cold statistical analysis forcing the issue into the open. When bureaucrats who had never held a bolter started producing reports showing that certain planetary designations correlated with 100% casualty rates across multiple independent expeditions, even the most stubborn chapter masters had to acknowledge that something unprecedented was occurring. The numbers didn't lie, even if the pride of the Adeptus Astartes desperately wanted them to. Worlds classified under the emerging cannibal planet designation showed loss ratios that made no tactical sense. You could throw a company at a demon world and expect survivors. You could assault a tyrannid-infested death world and fight your way back to extraction. But these particular environments consumed everything sent against them, with an efficiency that suggested the planets themselves had evolved specifically to defeat Space Marine expeditions. What made the reassessment so difficult was the complete lack of conventional enemies to blame. When a campaign fails against orcs, you can study orc tactics and develop countermeasures. When chaos corrupts a world, you can bring inquisitorial assets and specialized demon hunting units. But how do you develop tactics against an entire planet? How do you train warriors to fight soil that digests ceramite? How do you equip soldiers to survive air that rewrites their cellular structure? The traditional Space Marine approach of identifying problems and engineering solutions simply didn't apply. Every adaptation they tried, sealed armor, elevated positions, rapid extraction protocols, the planets seemed to counter within hours. It was as if these worlds learned from every expedition and became more lethal in response. The psychological impact on the chapters involved cannot be overstated. Space Marines are conditioned from childhood to believe in their own invincibility. They undergo hypno-indoctrination, genetic enhancement, and decades of training specifically designed to eliminate fear and doubt from their minds. When these warriors returned from orbit, having watched brothers dissolved, consumed, and torn apart without any possibility of meaningful resistance, something fundamental broke inside them. Chapter apothecaries reported unprecedented levels of psychological trauma among survivors. Veterans who had faced demon princes without flinching would wake screaming from dreams about the ground opening beneath them. The mental conditioning that made Space Marines fearless warriors worked against them here because their minds couldn't reconcile their training with the reality of facing enemies they simply could not defeat. Several chapter masters attempted to frame the withdrawal as tactical wisdom rather than defeat, arguing that resources spent on cannibal planets could be better deployed against actual threats to the Imperium. This reasoning found support among more pragmatic voices within the Administratum, who pointed out that these worlds typically held nothing of strategic value anyway. They weren't protecting valuable resources, controlling vital warp routes, or harboring enemy forces that might threaten Imperial interests. They were just patches of galactic real estate that happened to be incompatible with human life in the most aggressive possible way. Conquering them would prove nothing except that the Imperium could waste Space Marines on meaningless objectives. But other voices within the chapter command structures resisted this logic fiercely. The idea that any world should be declared unconquerable struck them as a dangerous precedent. If the Adeptus Astartes admitted they couldn't take one planet, what would stop enemies of the Imperium from seeking out other environments that might defeat them? What would happen to the mystique of Space Marine invincibility if word spread that certain death worlds had proven too deadly even for the Emperor's finest? These concerns weren't merely matters of pride, though pride certainly played its role, but genuine strategic considerations about how perceived weakness might embolden the Imperium's countless enemies. The compromise that eventually emerged satisfied no one completely, which probably means it was the right decision. Cannibal planets would not be officially declared unconquerable. Instead, they would be reclassified as requiring specialized assets that remained perpetually unavailable for deployment. The paperwork would show these worlds as pending conquest rather than abandoned, preserving institutional dignity while ensuring no more companies would be sacrificed to planetary digestive systems. It was bureaucratic cowardice dressed up as strategic patience, and everyone involved knew it. But it allowed the Space Marines to walk away without admitting they had encountered something they genuinely could not defeat. The bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium moves slowly, grinding through centuries of deliberation before reaching conclusions that often arrive too late to matter. But the protocols designating permanent exclusion zones around cannibal planets represent one of the rare instances where Imperial administration acted with something approaching urgency. After the catastrophic losses documented across multiple chapters, after the strategic reassessments concluded that conquest was mathematically impossible, the Administratum faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you officially declare that the Imperium cannot conquer something? The answer required creating entirely new categories of imperial classification, new protocols that had no precedent in 10,000 years of galactic expansion, and new enforcement mechanisms to ensure that future commanders wouldn't repeat the mistakes that had already consumed thousands of irreplaceable space marines. The classification system that emerged reflects the Imperium's characteristic blend of religious terminology and bureaucratic precision. Cannibal planets now fall under the designation Mundus Consumens Extremis, a classification that places them beyond even the standard Death World categories. Normal Death Worlds receive ratings based on the percentage of expeditionary forces expected to survive conquest operations. A Category 5 Death World might see 60% casualties. A Category 10 might consume 90% of any attacking force. But the Mundus Consumens Extremis classification operates on different mathematics entirely. It assumes 100% casualties regardless of force composition, regardless of tactical approach, regardless of how many resources the Imperium commits to the operation. The classification essentially declares these worlds unconquerable by any means currently available to Imperial forces, a statement that carries enormous weight in a civilization built on the assumption of inevitable human dominance over the galaxy. The practical enforcement of these exclusion zones involves multiple overlapping systems designed to prevent unauthorized approaches. The Navis Nobilite has updated all official star charts to mark these systems with warnings that override standard navigation protocols. Any navigator attempting to plot a course through these regions receives immediate alerts flagging the destination as prohibited, with automatic logging of any attempts to override these warnings. The Adeptus Mechanicus has installed automated warning buoys throughout the approaches to known cannibal planet systems, broadcasting continuous alerts in every major Imperial language, plus binary cant. These buoys don't just warn approaching vessels, they record identification signatures and transmit that information to the nearest Imperial monitoring stations, creating permanent records of any ships that venture too close. The Inquisition maintains special oversight of these exclusion zones, and their involvement speaks volumes about how seriously the Imperium takes the threat. Ordo Xenos investigators have standing orders to interrogate any vessel that returns from these regions, searching for signs of contamination or corruption that might have been carried back from these worlds. Several inquisitors have developed theories that cannibal planets might spread their influence through biological material attached to escaping ships, potentially seeding new worlds with the foundations of similar ecosystems. While no confirmed cases of such transmission have been documented, the theoretical possibility has prompted protocols requiring any ship that survives an encounter with these worlds to undergo complete decontamination procedures lasting months, with the crew held in quarantine until exhaustive testing confirms they carry no traces of foreign biological material. The Adeptus Astartes have incorporated these exclusion zones into their own strategic planning in ways that reflect the unique culture of each chapter. Most chapters have added these worlds to their records of honored dead, maintaining memorial entries for the brothers lost in early expeditions, while simultaneously marking these systems as forbidden territory. Some chapters conduct annual ceremonies commemorating the fallen, using these occasions to remind younger brothers that even the greatest warriors in the Imperium face limits. Other chapters have taken more aggressive stances, maintaining kill teams specifically trained to intercept any forces, Imperial or otherwise, that might attempt to reach these worlds. The concern isn't humanitarian, it's strategic. If Chaos forces or Xeno civilizations somehow harness the biological weapons present on cannibal planets, the threat to the wider Imperium could prove catastrophic beyond calculation. The exclusion zone protocols also include provisions for long-range monitoring that allows Imperial forces to observe these worlds without risking direct contact. Specialized survey vessels equipped with the most advanced sensor arrays available maintain orbital positions at extreme distances, recording data about atmospheric composition, surface activity, and any changes in the planetary ecosystems. This monitoring serves multiple purposes. It allows Imperial scholars to continue studying these phenomena from relative safety, building knowledge that might eventually contribute to developing countermeasures. It also ensures that the Imperium will receive early warning if these worlds somehow become more active or begin expanding their influence into surrounding space. Several monitoring stations have reported disturbing observations, suggesting that some cannibal planets might be slowly growing more aggressive, their hunting ranges extending further from the surface with each passing century. Though these reports remain classified and their implications are still being debated at the highest levels, the legal frameworks surrounding these exclusion zones carry penalties that reflect the severity of the threat. Any Imperial commander who orders forces into a designated mundus consumens extremis system without explicit authorization from the High Lords of Terra faces immediate execution, with their family lines subject to investigation for signs of corruption or heresy. The reasoning is straightforward. Anyone willing to waste Imperial resources on a conquest attempt that every available piece of evidence suggests is impossible must either be a traitor deliberately sabotaging Imperial strength or a fool so dangerous that they cannot be allowed to command anything ever again. Rogue traders who violate exclusion zones forfeit their warrants of trade, their ships, and their lives. Even the Inquisition requires special dispensation from multiple Inquisitor lords before any of their agents can approach these systems, and such permission is granted only under extraordinary circumstances. The existence of these protocols represents something remarkable in Imperial history, an official acknowledgement that expansion has limits, that some territories will never bow to human dominance, that the galaxy contains forces beyond even the Imperium's ability to overcome. For a civilization built on manifest destiny and divine right to rule, this admission carries theological implications that the ecclesiarchy has struggled to address. How can humanity be destined to inherit the stars if some stars harbor worlds that devour humanity without effort? The official position holds that these worlds represent temporary obstacles, challenges that will eventually be overcome when the Emperor's light grows strong enough to purify even these corrupted ecosystems. But privately, many Imperial scholars suspect that these exclusion zones will remain in place forever, permanent monuments to the limits of human power in a universe that contains horrors beyond comprehension. The question that haunts every Imperial scholar who studies cannibal planets is deceptively simple. Who made these worlds? And why? Because the more you examine the evidence, the harder it becomes to accept that these nightmarish ecosystems evolved naturally. The level of coordination, the precision of the biological mechanisms, the way every element works in perfect synchronization to consume intelligent prey. It all points toward deliberate design rather than random evolutionary development. Something created these planets, something engineered them as perfect killing grounds. And whatever that something was, it possessed biological knowledge so far beyond current Imperial science that the Mechanicus considers these worlds to be walking contradictions of everything they understand about life itself. The leading theory among those with clearance to study these classified records points toward the Old Ones, that ancient race of psychic beings who shaped the galaxy during the war in heaven millions of years before humanity ever crawled out of Terra's oceans. The Old Ones created the Eldar, possibly the Orcs, and countless other species as weapons against the Necrons and their Citan masters. They terraformed worlds and engineered entire ecosystems with the casual ease of an artist sketching on canvas. Could cannibal planets represent some forgotten weapon system from that primordial conflict? living fortresses designed to devour Necron forces before they could establish beachheads. The theory has merit, especially when you consider that several cannibal planets occupy strategically significant positions near ancient Necron tomb worlds. Perhaps these were defensive installations, biological minefields meant to slow or stop Necron expansion during a war that reshaped the very fabric of reality. But other scholars point to darker possibilities. The Necrons themselves possessed biotransference technology and worked alongside the Cetan, entities that consumed stars and fed on the life essence of entire civilizations. Could cannibal planets represent Necron experiments in biological warfare, attempts to create living weapons before the ancient machines committed fully to their metal forms? The cold, efficient logic of these ecosystems, the way they maximize caloric extraction and minimize waste, certainly mirrors Necron design philosophy. And there's something deeply unsettling about worlds that consume souls as readily as flesh, something that whispers of Cetan involvement in their creation. The Eldar maintain their own theories, though extracting information from them requires diplomatic efforts that rarely succeed. The few Farseers who have deigned to comment on cannibal planets speak of wounds in the galaxy and places where hunger became geography. Their cryptic pronouncements suggest these worlds might predate even the old ones, representing something fundamental to the universe itself, primordial expressions of consumption given planetary form. Some radical inquisitors have seized on these hints to propose that cannibal planets are manifestations of chaos, physical intrusions of the warp's endless hunger into real space. The emotional resonance these worlds generate, the terror, the despair, the overwhelming sense of being prey, certainly feeds the dark gods. But the biological precision argues against pure chaos involvement. The ruinous powers corrupt and mutate, but they rarely create with such mechanical efficiency. Fan theories within the community have proposed even more exotic explanations. Some suggest cannibal planets are tyrannid precursors, ancient bioforms seeded across the galaxy by the hive mind millions of years ago, lying dormant until the main fleets arrive. The similarities to tyrannid consumption patterns are impossible to ignore. The total resource extraction, the adaptive hunting behaviors, the way these ecosystems treat all organic matter as fuel for growth. Could these worlds represent the tyrannids' first experiments with galactic-scale predation, prototypes abandoned or forgotten as the hive mind developed more mobile consumption strategies? The theory would explain why tyrannid hive fleets have been observed avoiding cannibal planets entirely, steering around them as if recognizing kindred organisms that offer no nutritional value. The most chilling possibility is that cannibal planets are still being created, that whatever force designed them remains active somewhere in the galaxy, continuing its incomprehensible work. Imperial survey vessels have reported worlds that appeared normal in initial scans, but demonstrated cannibal characteristics within decades of observation. Timescales far too short for natural evolution. Are these planets transforming, awakening, following some ancient programming that activates when certain conditions are met? The implications are terrifying. Every death world in the Imperium could potentially become a cannibal planet. Every hostile ecosystem, a dormant trap waiting to spring. What we're left with is uncertainty, which might be the most frightening conclusion of all. The Imperium has cataloged threats across the galaxy: chaos, tyrannids, necrons, orcs, and developed strategies to combat each one. But cannibal planets represent something outside those categories, something that doesn't fit neatly into existing threat classifications. They simply exist, consuming everything that approaches, answering to no faction, and serving no agenda that Imperial intelligence can determine. They are hunger given form, predation elevated to planetary scale, and whatever created them either no longer exists to explain their purpose, or watches silently as the galaxy's mightiest warriors are devoured by worlds that shouldn't be possible. The mystery endures, and perhaps that's fitting. In a galaxy filled with horrors, cannibal planets remind us that some things remain beyond understanding, beyond conquest, beyond even the superhuman capabilities of the Adeptus Astartes. They are the galaxy's way of saying that humanity, for all its power, remains prey. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the architects of these impossible worlds might still be watching, waiting, hungry for whatever comes next. If you enjoyed exploring this nightmare with me, consider subscribing to the channel for more journeys into the darkest corners of the 41st millennium.